Hello again, and you're all very welcome to our Right to Change podcast after an extended break from late summer. And here we are in November. And today I'm very pleased to be talking to Councillor Lorna Bogue from Cork City, who I had the pleasure and privilege of listening to speaking at the Right to Change conference a few weeks ago in Dublin. You're very, very welcome, Lorna.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, great. And listen, the first question I want to ask you, because of what you spoke about a few weeks ago, is, and since then, last week, and for how many days, we've had meetings of all the best minds in the world, really,
Yeah,
over there.
sure.
Yeah, I know, of course, I was being a little bit exaggerating, perhaps. Climate action, COP, everything. Just give us your opinion on it, right? I mean, we've been listening to what's been on the news. What was your reaction to it?
Well, there was a lot of spin around it. I mean, the pledges that happened at COP26, they might have been acceptable maybe, decades ago, but they're not acceptable now, and
Yeah,
that's the problem. It's that, the entire thing about this climate summit is, in the first instance, everything is negotiated beforehand by the various different states. Okay, so the civil services of all of these states will
of
already
course, yes.
have reached their negotiating positions. And then, there's obviously the 2 weeks where all the various sort of world leaders show up and say how green they are.
Yeah,
But that's
yeah,
that's it. That's it. It's just like an expo for greenwashing, as far as I'm concerned. So I wasn't very surprised at the things that happened. I mean, like there's no meaningful curb on fossil fuel use, and that's the biggest thing, that is the biggest thing that needs to be stopped as soon as possible. And it just isn't being stopped. And I suppose the reason for that, and I suppose what I went into during the conference that we were at, is that this is to do with the normal operations of capitalism. So the two issues, climate crisis and capitalism, can't be separated from each other,
of
because one
course.
actually follows the other. And yeah, that's kind of I think that's the main point that environmentalists need to start getting across now. And some of them are starting to get it. Like I think Greta Thunberg has actually been getting better over time. She's becoming a little bit less acceptable in the mainstream. I can see people kind of starting to turn against her now that
Oh,
she's kind of
yes,
moved out from.
absolutely.
Yeah, well, this is it. But I suppose what I would say is kind of, you know, like all the people who are going to the school strikes and all of this kind of thing, they're young, but they understand completely what the problem is. And I think the time of them getting patronized is coming to a close now. And ignore them at your peril kind of thing.
Yeah, I
So.
really hope you're right, because
Mm,
that's there's a sort of a feeling of, I mean, exactly what you're saying. Um, from the point of view of, the Joe Bidens, and indeed our own people, and the Tory party in England, uh, there's no votes in this. There's no votes in telling people the truth, really.
um, well, there you see, I suppose
For the
yes,
people who vote for them, if you know what I'm saying. You're turning
yes.
around and telling the people who vote for them, well, in actual fact, there's going to be curbs in this and curbs in that. And you're going to lose an awful lot of money, or you're going to have to make, enormous investments. And they don't like hearing that.
Well, no, they don't. But you see, it is that particular capitalist class who are going to lose
Exactly.
out in this. And I suppose it is that reframing that we on the left need to do of the climate crisis as being a class issue. This is to do with capitalism. It's to do with class, and it's about us as a working class, I suppose, fighting for our own survival against an international capitalist class that is driving the changes in our climate. And yeah, so it's a real kind of existential thing. But I suppose the thing about it is that, you know, if we're to address climate crisis, you know, in this country, for example, like the way to do that is by doing things that would actually benefit the working class, and that's where this government is kind of going wrong, because everything is framed in that neoliberal frame of this will result in cuts. You know, we'll have to tighten the belts, austerity. Like we're seeing new kind of eco austerity happening, but that isn't actually the way that it will need to be. Like
Indeed.
the way that it would be is that, you know, you'd be making massive state investments in infrastructure in order to transition our economy to one that doesn't rely on carbon to exist. And you know, like that is beneficial. You know, that's something that, you
That
know,
would
can
be
only be
beneficial to
done.
everybody, because let's face it. I
Yeah.
mean, and when you listen to what was going on there last week at this kind of meeting, is that a lot of the effects of climate change, when we say, you know, you hear people here in Ireland saying, you know, and the weather is changing and everything, the effects of climate change have been with us for a long time, but they've been mostly in the countries that will be, you know, I mean, let's face it, I've always had a bit of a problem with the words underdeveloped countries. What they have been is actually neglected.
Yeah,
And the
yeah, but
problem
also
is already there.
subjugated.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah,
used in actual fact to create wealth for others that they see none of. And I mean, that's the sort of thing that it is already here, this. But I think until it affects, rather in the way the COVID thing, you know, has affected everybody. It doesn't differentiate between rich and poor. But of course, you know, they still manage to send the poorer people out to take the greatest risks, you know, which we
yeah.
could talk about as well. I'd just like to lead you into your first choice of music, Lorna. Would you like to tell us what it is?
Yes, well, the first one I'll go for is the Springhill mining disaster by Luke Kelly sings it, but it's by the Dubliners. So it's a song about that, exactly that kind of extractivist industry, which is the fossil fuel industry. And you know, even though the Springhill mining disaster happened, you know, well, this specific one was in '58, as the song
Yeah.
outlines. But you know, I think it just really outlines that connection between you know, the exploitation of labor and you know, the extractivist industries like fossil fuel industry.
Exactly.
So it's something that we've always known about, but I suppose it takes on a different meaning now in through the frame of climate crisis, because you know that line, like, you know, blood and bone is the price of coal. Like, you know, I think that takes on kind of different layers of meaning now. You
And
know,
it was never ever, of course, the blood and bone of the mine owners and the people who did really, really well out of it.
yeah, no, of course not. But that dynamic has always kind of existed. And I think there's a really interesting climate work has actually come out of the trade union movement through the ideas of just transition. So it is about, you know, there are people who are still working in the fossil fuel industry, and how do we actually transition them out of it in a way that is just and fair, so that we're not leaving people behind while we're changing to zero carbon economy and society. And again, like that's something that has been lost in the Green Party going into government. I mean, like in their climate bill, they mention just transition in the short title of the bill. So that's kind of just the preamble to the piece of legislation. So they put the words just transition in there, but they didn't put any legal definition of just
Yes,
transition in.
of
They didn't
course.
put anything in that actually would operationalize the ideas of just transition. And you know, it's these things that are going to be massive problems down the line, because what we're going to see is, you know, reasonably enough, people saying, well, this is my income, and I didn't have any choice in the matter, but now it's being sort of taken away from me.
Well, we've seen that already in an
Yeah.
awful lot of industries. We're going to take a minute to have a listen to Luke Kelly and the Dubliners singing the Springhill mining disaster, and we'll be back shortly after this.
In the town of Springhill, Nova Scotia, down in the dark of the Cumberland mine, there's blood on the coal and the miners lie in roads that never saw sun nor sky, roads that never saw sun nor sky. In the town of Springhill you don't sleep easy. Often the earth will tremble and roll. When the earth is restless, miners die. Bone and blood is the price of coal. Bone and blood is the price of coal.
Luke Kelly and the Dubliners with that wonderful Ewan MacColl song called The Springhill Mining Disaster, which, tells a story which it connects, really, doesn't it? It connects this fossil fuel thing with workers' rights in many ways, and like the lengths that these vested interests will go to when the little people stand up. We've seen it many, many times here in Ireland over the last while, when the little people stand up to say, well, we're not being treated like this anymore. Well, they're met with the full force of, God knows what.
Yeah, well, that's it, and that's the violence of the state is inflicted on people in service of this capitalist class, and sometimes you just have to ask, well, who is the state for? And obviously it should be for the working class, really, since we do all the work.
Yeah, sure, that's fair enough.
Road.
Yeah. And Lorna, I've just because it's something I've always been interested in, give us your definition of that phrase, the working class.
Well, you see, this is an interesting one, right?
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, because when we were putting together our program document, obviously part of that was that we would want to do the work of class formation and form a progressive working class. So I think that our definition of working class in Ireland is quite narrow. We tend to think of a kind of pastiche of, an industrial working class kind of person. And what we don't think about is, even if you manage to secure a mortgage and buy a house, you still have to work in order to pay off that debt.
Of course you do.
Sometimes we don't think of people who own houses as being working class, but actually, the only thing that they've managed to secure is, I suppose like a rental agreement, essentially, that goes on for longer.
Of course it does.
It's interesting. So we tend to think that once you have a house that you've kind of moved into middle class, but I actually think that middle class is kind of compacted away. And a lot of people in Ireland are actually working class. They just don't realise that they are, or they don't even like to conceptualise that they're working class. But if you have to work, and if you don't work, you would find yourself, destitute. Well, then you're working class. You depend on work in order to.
But isn't it kind of
continue?
What you're talking about there, and what you're talking about is that old word snobbery, really. And there's absolutely no, there's no harm in people who are very poor wanting to improve their situation. But suddenly, you're talking about their conception of themselves changes if they buy a house and have a car in the driveway, and they want their kids to go to college, they want their kids to have an education. But suddenly, because I've asked loads of people, are you working class? Are you working class? And some of them, they don't know. And some of them even go as far as to say, kind of like my parents were. But they don't feel like they are because they feel like they've gone up a little bit in the world or whatever.
Yeah, but you see, I suppose it's to do with the specific way that the Irish economy is aligned. So we're a tax haven economy, okay? And that means that it's expensive to live here. Because tax haven economies always are, like if you're giving away the services of the state all the time, and privatizing everything and privatizing people's need to do things or to have services, well then that becomes really expensive for people to live in, and like everything that we do in our lives here is monetized. Like we're one of the few countries in Europe that doesn't have public health care, like, just as a matter of course, which is highly unusual. If you want to drive a car, which in rural Ireland you basically have to do that because there's no public transport. So the public transport is privatized, and then on top of that, if you're driving a car, like your need to drive a car is monetized through the insurance industry to such an extent that like that takes up a large amount of your income. The housing is financialized in such a way that it's basically unaffordable. Childcare is essentially a second mortgage. So if you take all of these things together, even someone who could be doing quite well, like they're 1 month's pay away,
pushed to the pin of their collar, and 1 month's pay away from exactly.
Yeah. So we have to broaden out our idea of what working class is, because the country hasn't been industrialized in the same way as other EU countries. Like it's not, the working class here isn't necessarily grounded in that industrial working class, which is quite small here. Like what we have is like a foreign direct investment led model, which is a tax haven. And therefore, we actually have quite a large working class, and I would say larger than most other European countries. It's just that, because of the story that neoliberalism tells us, which is, this is the best things could ever be, better things can't happen, just accept this. People then will tell themselves like, oh, sure, I'm doing well. And the whole system relies on people actually telling themselves they're doing well.
Was this something maybe that was, I won't say fed to us, but it was part of the natural thing, say when you were in school, because it was study hard and you'll do well. You won't be like that thick chap over there, right? And you'll have A, B, C and D. He won't. And the way from many years, and particularly I suppose that what I still always insist on referring to, the egotree of the Celtic Tiger years, that was kind of the zenith of it. But there was this kind of a perception of like, if you were a tradesman, that wasn't the same as being a professional, and like, it's the same rubbish really, but it's been ingrained in Ireland. And somebody else said, and I think it's worth thinking about, is this idea we have of the great home ownership. I firmly believe everybody should have a home and nobody should be paying the exorbitant rents. But is that ingrained into us because of coming from our history, where the Irish people had nothing? You were constantly in hock to these landlords who were mostly, living in England and owned the land and everything. Is that something, that just aspiration, that was, a good aspiration, but maybe gone a bit mad?
I think, like, to answer that question, I think that you've actually kind of answered it, which is, to point to the Celtic Tiger, like, so that was a really interesting turning point, I think, in in Irish economic history, right? Because before that, like, you had this kind of professional bourgeois class kind of in charge of the country. So that's, like the judges, the doctors, the lawyers, the clergy, like,
Indeed.
this Catholic bourgeois that emerged after, independence of the state. And they were kind of in charge for, a very long time, and still are.
Well, I was going to
some
say, I
extent
thought they still
today.
are, sadly.
Yes. Yeah. So I suppose the thing that changed about the Celtic Tiger is that up until that point, the economy was relatively insular and not particularly open. But the Celtic Tiger was just kind of a series of events that ended up with that particular class suddenly having access to international capital. And then they started, I suppose, marketing the country. So
Indeed.
That's where we get this idea of Ireland Inc. towards the ends
Great
of
little place
international
to
capital.
do business.
So that to me is actually really where things started to slide out of control. So that class, I suppose, in effect disempowered themselves because they completely lost control of, I suppose, the steady state that they kind of had up until that point. And that introduction of like international capital is like kerosene, like kerosene on all of the markets, and everything got marketized. And we've ended up in the situation that we're in now, where like even parts of that bourgeois like are starting to feel the pinch, of things have inflated to such a point now.
So
but
when we
it's
have
so
the two
possible.
parties that at once upon a time could have had enough of a majority to run the country themselves, it now needs the two of them glued together in order to do it.
Yeah, well, this is it, because they over time what they've done is they've eroded people's material conditions to the point where they will say, well, actually, do you know what? I don't have faith in
this
you anymore.
at all.
So
It's
so that's
man's world.
yes, that's
I'm
a good
sorry, but you know
segue.
what it is? But in a way, I mean, and it wasn't exclusively men, but dear God Almighty, it was most of them. Would you like to tell me about your next piece of music that I've already kind of told everybody?
Yes, so it's Man's World by Marina. And yeah, she's a pop songstress who's doing
And you
lots
know
of
what? She's
really.
absolutely fabulous. I had listened to this earlier. It's great.
It's good, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
such a bop.
yeah.
Like, I didn't discover this by accident. My friend Sinead Mercier sent it to me, because she thought, I would like this song, and she's right. I really do like it, because she kind of covers topics that like in such an overt way, that doesn't really happen so much anymore. I think it's really good.
It's
And
absolutely
yeah.
wonderful. Let's sit back and
Yeah.
have a listen to Marina singing Man's World.
Cheeks are rosy like a bush at cherub. I'm a strawberry soda. Raise my lashes to heaven. Stars in my hair running like a waterfall. Clouds in the white of our eyes, we saw it all. Burn me at the stake, you thought I was a witch. Centuries ago, now you just call me a bitch. Mother Nature's dying, nobody's keeping score. I don't
And there we have Marina with Man's World, a new artist and a new song to me, but then I'm somewhat out of touch with things like that in the current pop music. But that absolutely beautiful, and making the point, a man's world, and God, look what they did with it. We have Ireland at the moment, right? Post Celtic Tiger, post this whole thing. Billy Connolly did a great sketch about, what would you get if you sold your place? That was, to go back a few years, that was one of the most popular things of conversation. What would you get if you sold your place? And as if it was some really clever type of thing, that you bought your little shack for 25 grand and now all of a sudden it's worth 600,000 because you're such a clever guy. And now, after all that, we have a situation where very often, Lorna, the children of these same people are going to be living at home in the box room till they're 35 or 40.
Oh yeah, well that's it. We're kind of moving into an economy like southern Italy, where people are still at home and don't have much prospect of getting out of the house. So it's it's not good at all. I actually found it interesting last night because same as yourself now would have been sort of looking at the latest government coming out and talking about COVID restrictions and all of this. Sort of panicking. The government is panicking a bit because they've, not done anything to stop this predictable event. But it was interesting because Micheál Martin was asked about, and what about restrictions on hotels? And he said, there'd be no restrictions. And then Gavin Riley actually made a really sort of hard-hitting point on Twitter, where he said, well, of course they can't do anything about the hotels because over 8,000 people call the hotel their private home in Ireland. Yeah. Isn't that mad? Like that there's about 8,000 people living in hotels, and that's their place to live,
That wouldn't have occurred to me, but true.
Yeah. And again, that's kind of going back to that Irish bourgeois. So, like a housing crisis is good for them because they're extracting higher and higher rents. Like people who are renters are price takers. They don't set the price because they don't have a choice. And then obviously the hoteliers get steady state business from putting all these people up,
Isn't that the way, like we could talk about housing, we could talk about health, we could talk about water. It's almost, there's no, you pay all your taxes, blah, 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 but there's no services available for you unless somebody is going to make a killing, and a bloomin' big killing.
Yeah, that's it. And that's the inefficiency that's inherent in the way that Ireland in particular is run, because I mean, like the operation of the business model that we have, where it's all big glass offices in Dublin, and Dublin is the biggest city, and everyone is kind of like coming in from the suburbs or from rural Ireland and commuting into Dublin, and then commuting back out again. That has sort of like just created, this society where like people are really precarious all the time. So like again, like I think to be working class is to be precarious or to experience precariousness as well.
Indeed.
And that's but the people like the capitalist class rely on people feeling precarious or feeling desperate in order to get them to do these jobs.
Indeed, and do them for not much money. I was talking to Yulia Marciniak from Unite a couple of episodes ago.
Oh, she was great, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, like, she's making the point. I've actually been out a few times going around handing out leaflets with people, and it would break your heart to go into some of the places, and some of the staff in some of these places, they're even afraid to look up or to be seen talking to you.
Yeah,
because they are that, as you call it, for the want of a word, precarious, do you know that it's just, they need to be kept there by these people. They need to be kept there because they don't want to see any organisation, and really they're being treated appallingly.
Yeah, yeah, and that's it, because I suppose, like people would think us on the left is like quite extreme and all of this, but I mean, I'm in favor of like planned economies. I'm in favor of a progressive working class and completely flipping things around, and and revolution and all of this, and it's for a quiet life, like that's all I want.
Yes, it is, but as well,
Yeah.
what occurs to me about it is what you're actually talking about. It's almost like you're talking about peace and love, if you like. That so many times, and it is to the advantage of these same people that you'll pick up the newspapers and you'll turn on the television, and you'll see people referred to as the hard left, the loony left, the this, that, and the other, when basically what people are looking for, what the left are looking for, I think I'd call it a bit of fairness, a bit of, that's the best word I can come up with,
It's decency,
Decency,
and like that people can live like dignified lives and just have a bit of dignity,
Exactly.
because that's what I think that's the worst part of my job as a counsellor. Like, you encounter lots of people who are living these really, like they feel undignified by their material
We
conditions.
heard Councillor Pat Dunn talking at the conference, where he's saying that he has a box of tissues on his desk for people who come in and break down crying.
Yeah, well, that's par for the course in being a counsellor. And but you see, like, these people are made to feel this way, like, by a system that benefits from their misery. Like, vast swathes of people are just miserable and immiserated by the inefficient economic system that we have. And it is that idea of socialism versus barbarism. Like, I think the capitalist system is barbaric. Like, I think that the way that it contorts people into these miserable shapes, like, is awful. And that's the thing that needs to change, and it needs to change quickly, especially given the climate crisis that we're in as well. Like, even the earth itself is being denuded in order that a few people might make enough money to build a rocket or whatever it is that they want to do this week.
Whatever they want to do this week. And is that just, it says a lot for us, maybe, that we all have allowed this to go this far. When people say, "Oh, I'd like a quiet life," well, guess what? Looking into the not too distant future, it'll be anything but a quiet life. So look, I'll tell you what. I'm going to ask you to introduce your final piece of music. Before I do that, I'm going to say thank you very, very much for talking to me. It's been an absolute joy and a pleasure. And
no, it was great.
I hope we're going to get to do this again sooner rather than later.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Tell us your third piece of music. I know you're going to make an old man very happy, because I know it's
Yes.
Rory Gallagher. I know it's Rory Gallagher. What is Rory Gallagher going to sing for us?
It's Crest of a Wave. Now, I don't actually have any massive political point about this.
Yeah, you know what? But you don't have to. Isn't that sometimes? Sometimes, guess what? I love a piece of music because of the sound of it.
Yeah. Well, it's the sound, and it's the words, and obviously the Cork connection as well.
The Cork connection,
but yeah. I wouldn't be a Cork City Councillor if I didn't mention Cork at least once, or several times.
Well, I could start. I could keep going on here. You could mention Freddie White. You could mention Jimmy Crowley. You could mention Jimmy McCarthy, songwriter.
Yeah.
You're not stuck for guys down in Cork, are you? Really?
No, we're falling down with talent around
absolutely.
Cork, all right. But yeah, no, I just ended up coming across this song kind of by accident, because like my dad would listen to a lot of Rory Gallagher, and to be honest, I didn't really get a lot of his music for quite some time, but like it was only when I was in the middle of the Green Party completely selling out, and all of this kind of stuff. And I don't know, I think you just have to be really hard done by to like
get Rory Gallagher. That was
yeah, I think so.
was the blues. Do you know what?
Yeah.
I was reading a book and watching a film, Martin Scorsese, and the story of the blues. And this guy takes him into a car, drives him outside of down the Mississippi Delta, and shows him people living in situations that you actually would not believe people could live in. And he said, that's the blues.
Yeah.
And that's what we've been talking about for the last half hour. That's the same thing. That's the blues. These people had, if you could have less than nothing. And now you'd understand the blues. And I think that's where Rory Gallagher comes in.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's very cathartic to listen to. But anyway, this one is Crest of a Wave, which obviously I kind of like as well, because the name of the party, An Rabharta Glas, is a green wave.
An Rabharta Glas, the green wave, and here we are on the crest of a green wave with Rory Gallagher.
Hopefully.
And here he comes.